If you have more to add, then go for it, Debbie, because I think I can go either way.
Our webinar is now live, so that you know, and people are coming in. I can see the participant numbers increasing. We're just we'll have a couple minutes while people get in the room. Hello, everyone. Let me get my Q&A box open. Okay. Welcome.
I hate to yawn on Zoom. It's not personal. It's just a long day and I forgot to drink coffee today. I kept microwaving it and microwaving it, and then I would not get it. So it's not personal. Very happy to be here. Just throwing that out there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's good. So welcome, everyone. It is Trans Day of Visibility, and we are glad you're here. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm just going to bring my notes over so I can see them. So hello to everyone. We're so pleased to have you here with us today to talk about self-care in a time of trans visibility. My name is Nikki Neuen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Executive Director of Trans Families. And I want to welcome all of our longtime friends who may have known us as Gender Diversity or through our conference, Gender Odyssey, and a warm hello to all of you who might be new to us. Trans Families was founded by Aidan Key in 2008 under the name Gender Diversity as a support group for parents with transgender children. At that time, it was virtually unheard of that a trans person would be supported and protected by their parents in their youth. Most trans people were forced to pretend to be someone else their entire childhood. So now, 13 years later, we're still just at the beginning of a true paradigm shift in the US, a cultural shift which demands that trans people be recognized, respected, and loved as full citizens with all the rights and accommodations that every human is owed. This year, we celebrate the first openly transgender person being elected to the state Senate. Yes. Another being confirmed by the state Senate to a federal appointment, the undoing of the transgender military ban, and widespread support of the Equality Act. But this paradigm shift also brings the astonishingly rabid response of lawmakers in our communities who want to roll us back to a time of homogenous status quo. The rush to pass laws across the country, making it illegal for trans people to exist in public spaces like schools and to receive medical attention, is frankly breathtaking. They want to ban us. They want to ban our babies, our families, our friends. And this is nothing to say of the amplified violence and obstruction that are perpetrated against the BIPOC trans community all the time. As painful as it is to have our humanity publicly debated and our human rights legislated, I believe that we will prevail. How can it not? When youth everywhere embrace the reality that gender expression and identity simply are not dictated by one's anatomy and culture. But if the long racial justice and equality battles of this country are anything to go by, we have a lot more ahead of us than we have behind us, which is what brings us to today's webinar. I want to introduce our speakers. Today we have Debi Jackson and Michele Angello with us. Debi Jackson became an advocate for transgender rights in 2014 when her speech about her daughter's transition at the age of 4 went viral. The once conservative Southern Baptist Republican from Alabama now speaks on behalf of transgender youth around the world and has been interviewed by media across the US, the UK, France, Greece, Russia, Ukraine, South Africa, Colombia, and Brazil. Debi is a founding member of the Parents for Transgender Equality Council and has been invited to speak at the White House, to the World Professional Association on Transgender Health, that's a mouthful, WPATH, as well as the Department of Health and Human Services. Also with us, hi Debi. Also with us is Michele Angello. She works with trans youth and adults, offering individual, couples, group, and family therapy, as well as corporate education and training on a variety of issues of sexuality, and has presented internationally. She offers sessions to people around the world via webcam. She has appeared as an expert on Dr. Phil, Larry King Live, The Tyra Banks Show, ABC Prime Time, Dr. Oz, and other television shows and documentaries, including the award-winning film Trans. She's an adjunct professor at the graduate program of the Center for Sexuality Studies at Widener University, and developed the first graduate course in the United States that focuses on clinical issues in transgender communities. She is also the author of Raising the Transgender Child, a complete guide for parents, families, and caregivers, which came out in 2016. So, welcome everybody. While Debi and Michele are presenting, you'll be able to put your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screen, and I'll be watching those, and I'll help to facilitate any answers and questions that come up as we go. Otherwise, we have a Q&A time set aside at the end. So, is that all I have to tell you all before we get rolling? I think so. So without further ado, Debi, let's talk about balancing advocacy and privacy.
All right. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Nikki, are you gonna share the screen? Getting there? You're muted. There we go. All right. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. My portion of our time together is focused on public activism and ways that you can advocate and lobby in support of trans youth. And I know that can be a really, really scary concept right now. Visibility also means vulnerability, especially in the time with all of these different bills that are popping up in half the countries or half the states across the country right now. But it also makes a lot of people decide that it's not a time that they want to remain quiet. It is a time that they want to get involved somehow. And you need to make a decision for yourself, for your family, for your child on how you can participate in activism while maintaining some privacy, while keeping yourself safe. And there are a lot of different ways that we can do that. So Nikki, if you want to go to the next slide, we will jump in. And we'll jump in with that question: should you jump into public advocacy? There are some things that you should take into consideration before you decide that you're going to head to the Capitol, that you're going to call up the news media and decide that you've had enough of these bills, that you just want to tell your kid's story, your family's story, make people understand, force them to listen to you. First and foremost should be, do you have your child's approval? And this is a tricky one. When I first gave a speech about our family's journey, my daughter was 6. 6-year-olds really probably don't have the ability to give full consent because they don't understand the internet. They don't understand that once something is out there, it's going to last forever. But we still can talk about how we can share parts of our story and let them know that what we are doing is going to be small steps, baby steps that are designed to help them and help their future. and not necessarily have to out them. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about now are things that you can consider based on the age and the maturity of your individual child. One of the other things to think about is your family members, your spouse. Do they want to have a public presence with you? Do your kids have siblings? And if you're suddenly out in the public, their siblings and their friends are going to see it. And it's not just your child's life that ends up on display. Your siblings also feel like they have been put out into the public too. Extended family, if you have that grandparent or that sister-in-law who's just not really supportive of your kid, you need to think about ways that you'll be able to deal with any kind of potential backlash that they have. If there's any custody case issues going on, really think long and hard about it. Having an unsupportive parent use this against you in court is something that has actually happened before. So really just take into consideration all the other family members and where your relationship stands with them. Another big important one is, do you know the language and how to speak about general trans issues or LGBTQ issues? I've seen some people who have just learned that their kid is transgender a month before they go and testify. And the language that they use is stuff that makes a lot of the other trans folks in the room cringe, saying, my daughter was my son, or was born a boy and is now a girl, or even saying transgendered at times when they're giving testimony. So just making sure that you've brushed up on the vocabulary and that you know how to speak about trans issues without causing harm to any of the other trans people that might hear you is really important. And then, do you have a story worth telling? Of course you do. Of course you have a story worth telling. So this is your time to figure out what that is. For me, the reason that my story went viral is because I announced myself as a conservative Southern Baptist Republican. No one could have imagined that I would be speaking positively about trans people and about supporting and affirming my child with that kind of a disclaimer about myself. So it's important that you are able to really connect with people. We're not just going out and making logical arguments about these bills or doing the advocacy work. We're really trying to touch hearts. And by doing that, you have to figure out what is the hook of your story. Is it that you were a supporter of LGBT issues, but then this threw you off and you had to learn about trans people? Is it that you come from a position of faith and that you really had to struggle, or that you didn't struggle right away, that it made your faith stronger? Is it that you have been so concerned about the things that might happen that you're considering moving to keep your child safe? There are a lot of things that you can say that tug at the heartstrings, and they don't have to be the negative ones either. Positive stories are amazing. We need more of the positive stories. The euphoria your child felt the first time that you used their right name, or that someone in public gendered them correctly, a total stranger. These are the kinds of pieces of your story that you latch onto and you explain to people when you're doing advocacy. All right, we'll go on. So the question I get a lot of the time is, how public is public? People see that our story was online and went viral. They see my daughter mentioned in newspapers and in magazines and on the cover of magazines and all kinds of things like that. And they think, well, I don't ever want to do that. I don't want to have to get up and give a speech in front of a few thousand people. And that's great. You don't have to. There are many ways that you can be public and do advocacy that leave you totally anonymous. And we'll get into the specifics of each of these in a minute, but let's just run through them. Anonymous in public media, online with an advocacy profile or screen name, visible with a pseudonym, visible with your real name, and some personal known info. All right, we'll go to the next one. Okay, so let's start with anonymous, visible but unknown. Most people don't realize that this is how we started our journey into advocacy. The very first bit of advocacy that we did, and the one that I thought was going to be our one and only venture into advocacy actually, was for our local newspaper. And we were completely anonymous in it. My daughter was named AJ, and I was simply known as AJ's mom. Her dad was listed as AJ's dad. And there were a couple of photos, but it was of her hands holding something, and it was the back of her as she looked through the clothes in her closet. So we really did start completely anonymous and with no photos. We didn't show photos of her for about 2 years into our advocacy journey. Some of the great things that you can do being anonymous, where you're visible to the public but still unknown, are letters to the editor. Right now, there are so many people who are letting their voices be known in the public sphere about these anti-trans bills. So many things that I read are about boys and girls sports, keep the men out of girls sports. You could write a letter to your editor right now and pick any name that you want to send in with it. They're not going to check who you are. They're not sending for an ID before they publish that letter. That's a great way that you can do it. You can also send letters to your legislative bodies the exact same way. Pick a pseudonym. They only need to know your address as a way of knowing where you are a constituent. Nikki, do you see the screen that we lost our slides? Okay. The only way to know that they only care about where you live. And if you don't want to have your address as any part of a public record, like if you submit testimony, it's public. A letter to your legislative representative is not. But I've got a PO box down the street. And at one point in time, I asked a friend who owned a business if I could use that person's address. They really only care about your zip code and voting area. So that's another great way to do it. Talk radio. Yep. I listened to talk radio, conservative radio for 20 some years. And there was a point in time I called into Rush Limbaugh and I told him I had a trans kid. And it was not the most pleasant conversation, but some of his listeners had to hear me. And our local radio talk show programs are the same. They will talk about trans issues from time to time. Call in, pick a name, tell your story. It's a great way to practice telling your story without a lot of pressure on you. Or you could start a blog. That's another great way, and a way that a lot of parents really start in advocacy. Just on that, be careful about how much you share, because some people come back later and regret that they shared a lot of intimate details about their kid's life, thinking that it was always going to be private. And then at some point later, someone figured this out and they wish that they had not been quite so open. But it still is a good idea and a way that you can start practice telling your story. All right, now we move to semi-visible. What I mean by this is that maybe this is where you show your face. You show up somewhere, but you don't have to show up as a parent of a trans child so that people know that all of your family's personal business. You can say that you're an ally. You can say that you have a friend who is transgender, or you have a loved one who's transgender, or even just, I've always been an ally to the LGBT community and I really didn't know anything about tea. I learned about it and now I want to do more. So how can you be an ally in that regard without necessarily having to talk about your personal life? You could go to your medical office and you could point out that their forms are really not the most trans affirming. And you could say, you know what, if I had a friend who is trans or non-binary, I don't think I would recommend them coming here because your forms don't give a space for them to list their pronouns or an alternate name. You could propose your local school board pass inclusive policies or allow a GSA to be started in the school. You could even run for the school board yourself. I have a few friends who have done that when they got tired of not making any progress in getting those inclusive policies pushed through. So jump into politics a little bit and run for that school board. You can meet with your legislators in their offices as a concerned constituent. And yes, in the time of COVID, I know that offices are not necessarily where you want to be. That's okay. I did a virtual lobby day just last week, and you can have meetings that get set up via Zoom or phone calls. That's just as effective. When that happens, you have a chance to tell your story more openly and fully. A lot of times, if you want to do some sort of public testimony, you're limited to 30 seconds or 2 minutes. But if you make an appointment and you meet with a legislator, you can get 10, 15, sometimes 30 minutes of their time. They will ask you questions, and you really get to do a deep dive into your family story, which is a super effective way of making them see our kids as real and legitimate, and making them maybe switch the way they, the position that they held on something, because you're touching their heart. All right, you could then baby step into media with an interview, but with no photos. And that's just taking you back to what I said as the example of how we started. We did the interview, we told our story, no photos. You could pick a pseudonym for that as well. Visible in the media. This is where we are now. We are very visible. Our daughter has been very visible, but you don't have to be. When I first started out, those first couple of years, I was doing a lot of interviews, and we never showed my daughter's picture. And the reason that we were able to do that is because we had really good supportive people in our lives at that point in time. They knew not to tag me on Facebook personally. They knew not to tag my husband. They would talk about us with first names only. They were really respectful of the information that they shared, and they were protective of our family. So if you have that kind of system in place, you can jump in and be a little more visible without necessarily having your children in the spotlight. If you're going to go the route of talking to the media, and I will say right now, it might not be an intentional thing. If you go to your Capitol and you testify, media might contact you. If your name or phone number is added to public testimony, you might have reporters reach out because they want to do follow-up stories. That happens a lot. Consider the media training, or at the very least, vet the media. Check up on the reporter, see if they've done any stories about trans people before, and see what the slant was. Ask them if they're going to interview both sides, because that's often not a good thing, or you at least know the kinds of things that might be said that you need to rebut in your own statements. And make sure that they know things like a trans one-on-one resource on basic language and vocabulary, so that you don't see something later in print that makes you cringe. Also, be prepared for difficult questions, and know that you don't have to answer any question that is asked of you. I have been getting questions since my daughter was 6. Has she had the surgery? Is she going to have the surgery? That's really intrusive. We've all seen it happen. We've probably all experienced in our own lives. But when a reporter is asking you questions, you feel really odd sometimes, not providing any sort of answer. So there are 3 different ways that you can deal with it. You can deflect or just shut it down completely and say, that's highly inappropriate. I will not answer that question. You could partly answer and say, do you know not all trans people do get surgeries? And by the way, my child is too young. We're not there yet. But maybe you could ask trans adults what they feel about surgeries and the availability of them. You could also fully answer and say, my child has been asking about surgery for several years, but obviously that's a decision they will make when they are old enough, in consultation with their doctors and their therapists. So I can't answer that because it's not my body. That's one way to do it. Another example of this just happened about a month ago. I was watching a legislative session in one of the states where there were 2 bills on the table, the one to ban medical care and the one about sports. So a mom went to testify about her daughter participating in sports. And in our state, she had to meet certain criteria, meaning she had to have been on testosterone blockers for at least a year and be able to show that with a letter from a doctor. So she's testifying that her daughter had met all the criteria and participated in sports and no one had a problem with it. One of the legislators, who was a co-sponsor of the medical care ban bill, started asking, so what age was your daughter then when she was playing sports? What age had she started the blockers? And the mom knew exactly where it was going. This is a person who didn't believe in blockers. So she just kept saying, she met the criteria. And then he would ask again, and she would say, she met the criteria. The criteria doesn't mention age. It mentions a year on blockers. I don't know why her age is relevant. And she did a masterful job of not getting caught in some sort of trap that he was trying to set for her. And that's another great way to handle inappropriate questions. So the last one would be to think about media options that work for you. That could be your local newspaper or your local TV news if you know that they are one of the more LGBT positive and friendly outlets that you've seen in your area. There are definitely some news stations that tend to always take a negative slant or are not as balanced as we would like in their presentation. It's good to know the media. But you could also find your social media hubs. You could submit something to the Advocate or to an LGBTQ friendly page and that kind of media. BuzzFeed LGBT. There are a lot of the different hubs that have LGBT specific tabs, pages, parts of their media, and those are great places to start submitting some of those letters, to submit a guest blog post and tell some of your story. And then finally, the reason that we are here. I always talk to parents about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I want to remind you, advocacy calls for different skills and roles. You don't have to be out in front being the supportive person who's writing those letters to the legislators, being the person who talks to a school administrator, one school administrator at a time, calling them every single week, being the squeaky wheel. That's behind the scenes work. That's the work that makes the biggest difference. It really isn't the public part. It's the part that's behind the scenes, having those longer, more involved relationships, one-on-one conversations, letting them see that your story is evolving and developing over 6 months or a year. Those are the places that we can have the greatest impact. So don't feel like you have to be super visible and public. Don't think that your child has to be super visible in public. There are a lot of ways that we can do this work, and every single one of those roles is very important. Remember that bringing public attention to ourselves can help more people know about the cause, but it also opens us up to vulnerability and to scrutiny. I can't tell you how many times people have made a judgment about us based on a 30-second clip on the news. They think they know everything about our family when they got 30 seconds out of a 30-minute interview. Even that is distorting and distilling our story down to a couple of sentences. There's no way they could understand anyone's entire life from just a few comments, but you will get judged. We're living in a very judgy time. And finally, advocacy can be exhausting. I have been going to the Capitol, 2 capitals actually, Kansas and Missouri, because we live on the state line, for 6 years in a row. And I'm to the point where I'm not the most patient person giving testimony anymore. They know that I'm there and I'm tired and I'm cranky and I'm angry. So it is exhausting. Doing this work every day is exhausting, but it can also feel amazing to know that you are having a great impact on the world and supporting your child and making their future better. But self-care is so critical. Have that self-care plan up front, because I fell into this by accident and I didn't have it. And you don't want to get to the point of burnout, and you don't want to get to the point of burnout in front of your kid. That's not going to help everybody. Put that oxygen mask on first. That's the only way that you can be the best parent you can be. And I'm really grateful that Michele is here to teach us how to do it, because I need lessons in this too.
Thanks, Debbie. It's always a pleasure to share time with you. self-care, it's a concept that most of us are so much better at preaching than practicing. And as Debbie said, much like the familiar advice on an airplane, when the oxygen mask descends, the first rule is always to put your own oxygen mask on first before you assist anyone else. And the only way to effectively help others is by caring for ourselves. It's one of the most important and one of the most often forgotten things we can do for ourselves, but also for our families. Because I'm stubborn, it helps me to remember that when my needs are taken care of, the people I care for are going to benefit too. So, Nikki, if you can, just a couple of quotes so that we can define self-care, which is an intentional and self-initiated process widely accepted as an essential tool to enhance well-being, and an important and valuable principle emphasizing the active role of maintaining one's own well-being. And this is me, not some like person with the last name M.E., but me, Michele Angello, 2021, said self-care is not self-indulgent. Taking action is a form of self-care. And I realized after I put that quote on the slides, I was like, there's something familiar about this. So I need to acknowledge the fact that, in fact, it shouldn't have been attributable to me, but somebody you might be familiar with named Audre Lorde actually said much before 2021, I've come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is actually an act of survival. Next slide, Nikki. Yes. So the necessity of self-care, and as parents and caregivers, you're serving a dual role here, and it's important to recognize that. So obviously you're here as parents and caregivers, and you're also here as an advocate for your child, which might seem like one and the same, but when you are advocating for something like basic human rights, which we should never have to advocate for, it is an entirely separate role. And so we do need to acknowledge and keep that in mind as we move through these slides. So the necessity for self-care is to help avoid compassion fatigue during stressful times, and doing something to rejuvenate yourself can be exactly what is needed in the midst of that chaos. It also helps to minimize self-doubt. Some of the things, excuse me, that I hear from parents are, am I losing my mind? Am I handling this correctly? Should I be doing something differently? Does every other parent know, except me, how to handle this? Third is identifying signs of burnout. Things like, I'm not eating or sleeping. I've begun to have panic attacks. My kids are starting to ask me if I'm okay. And the fourth is self-care allows you to keep fighting, so you can advocate for your family. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but we need to be ready to do it. And you're prepared to talk to the legislators or to do some of the other behind the scenes work that Debbie mentioned. So it is not, as I said, and more importantly and more eloquently, as Audre Lorde said, is not self-indulgent. It's actually something that we need to learn in order to really survive, and not just to survive, but actually eventually to thrive. I like to ask the question, what's getting in the way of your self-care? Do you think that you're being selfish by putting your needs first? And this is actually kind of a ridiculous question that I'm asking, because if you're here, I'm going to answer the question for you. Yes, you do think it's selfish to put your needs first. So refer to slide 1, self-care is not self-indulgent. Is it frightening to think of your own needs? Absolutely. Because we're desperately wanting and needing to be assured that everybody else is okay before we acknowledge our own needs, it's incredibly frightening, because it's virtually impossible for us to look around, especially when we have children we're caring for, and have any sense of confidence that their needs are completely cared for. So we often do put ours aside. And if the answer to that, so about the question, what is that fear about? And again, it's usually, am I being a good enough parent? Are my kids being taken care of? What else should I be doing? Do we have trouble asking for what we need? Aren't we supposed to have all of the answers as parents? These are all, by the way, misconceptions, but I'm just throwing them out there because I hear them a lot from parents. Is it a sign of inadequacy when I have to ask for help? Do I feel like I have to prove that I'm worthy to myself or someone else? How has the current zeitgeist that we're living in impacted your vigilance as a parent of a trans or non-binary kid? It's terrifying when people in power are attempting to delegitimize your child and your family. Or your kids have less access to in-person support. And so what are you going to do in order to compensate for that? These are, again, things that we feel like we have to have answers for. Have you established a support network of other trans and non-binary kids? This is critical, and it's part of the reason that we're here tonight. If you don't yet have this established, please be in touch because we can certainly help put that into place. I've found in my practice that the number one variable to a successful transition for a trans person is having strong family support. And I found that the number one variable to having parents stay strong and stay supportive is to have other parents and caregivers in their support network so that they can bounce things off of them.
Michele, there's a question related to the Lord quote, which is, if you could speak to the connection between self-preservation and political warfare.
Well, I think it's important to find ways. So let me add the words self-compassion to our self-care conversation. Because when we're in the midst of warfare, we have to find compassion for ourselves. I'm not talking about find compassion for quote unquote the other side. It's much like when Debbie said, is the media going to be interviewing the other side? I refuse to do those interviews because it's like saying, let's have some Black folks on and let's make sure we have the KKK on too so that we can show the other side's perspective. There is no other side in this fear mongering that people have to experience. So I'm sorry, Nikki, can you ask the question again because I'm self-preservation in the midst of warfare?
Yeah.
Well, I think that we have to find ways to preserve oneself of sanity and to preserve oneself of emotional stability if we're going to be able to continue the work. And it is war right now. It is war when half of the states in the country are trying to push, again, to delegitimize people's lives. Was there anything else that I see now that there are a couple of questions? Should I move on or? Okay. So the next slide, please. So we're in it for the long haul. I'm actually going to switch up the order. So if you don't mind just putting all three up. Oh, back. Yeah. So I'm going to go to number 2 first. And because it's easy to fall into the trap of subjugating your own needs when you see your child in pain. This is going to show up something like, I don't need sleep. There's work to do. I don't have time to eat, or I don't have time to be sick. I don't deserve to have fun when my child is suffering. I'm not connecting with other people who love me because I'm busy leading the charge. I don't need therapy until my kid's okay. And my response to that is those are all admirable responses. And it's actually okay to step away for a bit and to recharge. It's not just okay, it's vital and it's critical. Depending upon the age of your child, you might be spending a lot of energy protecting them from hearing or witnessing what's happening. So COVID has been, I don't know, I guess a blessing and a curse. I think as a lot of people call it a blurse, where for some of my clients, trans families in particular, for some of my clients who feared disclosing to peers, who feared going to school as themselves, or they just weren't accepted in general, it was kind of a blessing to be able to be homeschooled and have family who appreciated them and have more time to spend with loved ones. On the other hand, for some folks, some folks for whom school was really their only safe place. It's been a really, really difficult time to not have opportunities to be validated for who they are. When it comes to you, and I say, depending upon the age of your child, there will be times when it's not going to be a good idea. For very young children, it's rarely a good idea for them to be watching the news for any extended period of time, but especially now, regardless of the age of the child, sometimes we're going to have to shut that down just to give them a little bit of a break, not to keep them oblivious, but just to keep them feeling safe enough, as long as there are ways that we can surround them with love and safety in their own homes. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about vicarious trauma. This is typically something that we talk about with as counselors who work with trauma, who work with victimization. It's the emotional residue of exposure that working with people who have traumatic experiences have on counselors. But I also would extend this to say vicarious trauma, certainly in this case, is relevant to parents of trans and non-binary youth, because you are on the front line and you are living it even more so than the therapist is living it in that case. And you're living it sometimes with a level of pain and terror that is difficult to endure at times. So it's especially important for parents and caregivers, because we are being held responsible to be the protectors of our children, when other places that we take for granted, schools and churches and your primary care doctor, might not be stepping up. So again, self-compassion is really going to be critical in avoiding the perpetuation of vicarious trauma. Next slide. So go ahead and put them all up. I'll go through them. So let's move through then. What do we do from here? Let's acknowledge. Well, let's not stick with the I'm fine, we're fine. That's not going to work, because it's not the truth right now. So it's okay to sit with the reality that you're doing this without a roadmap. It's not fair that your child or your family is being violated in this way. I call this the awareness stage, and it's an important stage to sit with, to move on to the next one. So finding ways to recalibrate, finding the folks who are going to empathize with your situation, asking yourself what you need or what would be beneficial to you right now. What is my inner dialogue, and how is it serving me, or how is it continuing to torture me right now? If you're sitting with the I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough, everybody else knows what I'm doing, that is just self-imposed torture, and that needs to be shut down. I do a whole other workshop on disciplining, on mental discipline around shutting down those negative internal dialogues. So when we find ways to when we find ways to recalibrate and get a sense of that, that's really the acceptance stage of the fact that some of these coping strategies might not be working anymore. And then finally, the last two stages are going to be how you adjust. So restabilizing, how might my experiences help other people? I must remind myself that my family is resilient. Have I been giving my child too much leniency since all of this began? Or do they need some more boundaries to help them feel safe? Have I put up too many restrictions around my child in an effort to keep them safe? So just checking in on what needs to shift a little bit. So we were in crisis mode. We do certain things when we're in crisis mode. And when we're starting to work our way out of crisis mode, we need to restabilize. And finally, and hopefully everyone will come to the stage of thriving. So it's clearly easier said than done, but it definitely can be done, and it's not a linear process. So we might recycle through some of these stages, and that's okay too. But appreciate the times when you notice improved communication between your family members, increased ability to support one another, glimpses of hope, and even alleviation of the intense fears. And I encourage families to write a narrative that includes what is positive or what's even euphoric about being a trans family. Because we spend so much time on the dysphoria and all of the other things that folks have to go through, that I like to shift it to what's what's not amazing about the experience of everything we had to go through up to this point as far as the delegitimization of a person's identity, but more just about our family and our resilience. And then finally, the shift. Next slide. Thanks. And these are just some questions that I invite you to use whenever you're feeling yourself spinning with anxiety or worry, because our coping strategies change with time and they change with experiences, and they change with environmental external factors. So what ways have you historically taken care of yourself and your family? Sometimes, like I said, it's shut off the news or reinforce family connections, remind your child repeatedly of how amazing they are. Just check in about all the folks you do have around you who are supportive. And then what has changed since COVID or since your child disclosed their gender? Sometimes it's a lot has changed since both. Sometimes it's that we're feeling kind of isolated. My kid misses being validated at school. Sometimes it's we're just not able to spend time with the family that used to be so supportive. So what can you do about that to shift? Can you reach out a little more virtually? Can you find the folks that can be a part of your bubble that will reinforce some of this self-compassion and self-care that's desperately needed? And finally, push your levels of creativity. What would you like to do or try that's different from what you've tried before? And the sky is the limit for this. It can be anything from mindfulness to community building, joining support groups, read more, have coffee with a friend, take up painting, work out, garden, take a walk. And then again, I love when families come in and they say, oh my gosh, I used to mourn the fact that I couldn't or didn't imagine being able to play football with my child or walk my child down the aisle, or all of the things that, again, we as parents have these perceptions for our children, most of which probably wouldn't have come true regardless of if they were trans or cis, but we put a lot of weight into them and a lot of comfort in them. And so let's rewrite that really exciting narrative, which, by the way, may or may not come true of your trans kid either. But what kinds of things do we want to throw our energy into and stop, or at least minimize the stress and mourning process that many might be experiencing, and really turn it into, wow, this has the potential to be incredibly exciting.
Thank you, Michele. So we had a few questions come up that I believe we've answered so far, but I want to invite you all who are in the webinar with us right now, if you have additional questions that you want to bring up, please type them in the Q&A and we'll see that. Meanwhile, actually, Michele and Debbie, if you could unmute yourselves. I'm curious, right now, whether you're actively fighting legislation or whether you're just trying to survive COVID with your families, what are your go-to things right now to take care of yourselves?
I enjoyed COVID because I'm an introvert, and as much as I love traveling and hanging out with the two of you in particular, sometimes it's just mentally draining. So I actually adapted really well to COVID life. I did not start baking bread like a lot of other people do. One of my things of self-care is cooking. I love to cook. I had dreamed of being a chef when I was a little kid. I find comfort in being able to just break away from everything, put on a podcast or some music, and just focus on creating something wonderful and tasty and comforting. So I probably have gone back to a few too many Southern, lots of buttery casserole types of things, which is why the face is a little rounder than it was a year ago when we were last together. But that's part of my self-care, is just taking care of my family, and the way that I can take care of them is providing good meals while we're here, having everyone sit down together and talk while we eat. I also get really tired with with Zoom and the Zoom fatigue. As an introvert, you have to like be on and paying attention all the time. So it's really exhausting. But getting away from screens, then like reading an actual magazine. I love to read things that are not with bright lights in my face, like the ring light that's glaring in my eyes right now. So it's just those little things. We have chickens in the backyard. It's really nice to go sit on the back porch and watch chickens meander very slowly across the yard. It's like the fish tank or something, that it's just kind of mesmerizing. You just get lost in it. It's a little bit hypnotic, but also just having that one good friend that we can get on the phone. We chat about nothing. She's an extrovert. She does her dishes. She tells me all the random things that pop into her head, and I just listen, because it's not focused on these things. It's about the kids. It's about the husband. It's this new thing she found in the grocery store. Just anything that completely takes my mind off of it, because if I don't have those things, I'm reading the news. I'm writing an article. I'm looking up what legislation is moving in which state and which one I need to be focused on. So for me, self-care has usually been doing some sort of activism, because then I don't feel helpless. But right now there's so much of it that my self-care has been making sure that I find those times to actively get away from screens, to not think about the news, and to connect with other people.
Watch chickens.
Watch chickens with a glass of wine in hand, preferably, but
Yes.
not all the time.
Before you answer the self-care question, I want to address a question from Dean, who's in the audience. Dean has been asking about the dynamic of a parent who's trans and their children, grown children. And so I'm wondering, Michele, if you have any particular pieces of advice or aspects to notice or think about in this particular moment for someone who's in Dean's position.
Sure. So the discuss families with trans parents are only, okay, I'm sorry, I was just trying to find the whole question. So it was, Dean is trans and has cisgendered children and is wondering about support for Dean or for the kids.
Both. I think both, but generally from a former question that was posted, there's the dynamics between Dean and Dean's children are they're still getting figured out, is what I understood from the earlier question.
Okay. One of the things to give thought to is ages that the kids were when a parent comes out, because there are a lot of developmental stages that people are going through. And if these folks were already adults when their parent came out, then maybe that's going to be a different answer. I know that Collage used to have a trans kid group, and I don't know how active they are anymore, but I know years ago, Monica Canfield-Lenfest put up a booklet on being the kid of a trans parent that I thought was pretty helpful. And there are some, not many that I know of, but a couple of support groups for kids who have trans parents that might be helpful to just check in and see what's getting triggered, if they're challenging, if they're having a hard time with a trans parent. I work with a lot of families who have kids anywhere from the age of 3 to 25, perhaps, who, the 3-year-old or the 5-year-old or even the 10-year-old handles it much differently than the 15-year-old who's experiencing their own developmental questions around orientation and gender. I had a family not too long ago who had an 8-year-old child and a 14-year-old child. The 18-year-old child, when the parent came out, was like, this is so awesome. We're going to be able to paint our nails together and go shopping, and this is going to be fun because I'll have 2 moms. And the 14-year-old kid is like, don't ever come to my soccer game. Don't do this. Don't do that. It's embarrassing because everybody's going to think that I'm a weirdo, you know, all kinds of really hurtful things. But the kid was 14 and had their own stuff that they were experiencing. 14 is the perfect age as far as, well, the perfect age that most kids that are 14 are assholes, but the perfect age where they're doing their own, you know, Erickson's stage of identity versus confusion is right then and there. Like they've got everything they're trying to work out in their own body and brain. And so when we throw something else into the mix at that point, we're actually handing them kind of a silver platter of how to rebel against us. So I don't know that that's anywhere near Dean's age category, but something to keep in mind for, you know, all of the ages.
Yeah. And middle school is rough. It's rough for everyone.
Yeah, I've never met a person who's been like, yeah, you know, middle school was the best time of life.
No, it was certainly the worst time in my personal developmental life. I'm so glad it's over. I will never, ever go back. I have a question for Debi. This is from Amy. I think, Debi, you're really good at answering questions like this. You've had a lot of experience responding to things like this. And the question is, how do you tell a young niece or nephew that their aunt is actually their uncle?
That's more of a Michelle question.
Oh,
No, I think it depends on how young is young. Kids are generally really, really open-minded if you just, you know, are able to explain to them. Uncle Joey, we thought was a man, and he was really, really unhappy with that, and felt like he would be a lot happier if he started living as Aunt Joanne. And we've talked to Aunt Joanne, and she is doing wonderfully, and she is so happy, and she's glowing, and I can't wait for you to see her again and meet the new and better version of her. Just keeping it really positive, really simple. There are also a lot of really great books. I wish I knew the list right off the top of my head. I go to Goodreads and just type in transgender book list, or even just Google Goodreads transgender book list. And there is a list that has been growing over the years and probably has at least 80 different books on it that talk about kids transitioning, gender fluidity, when an adult transitioned. I think it's one with rabbits or a bear that like the adult transitioned in the child's life. I can picture the cover of it right now. But it's really great at explaining the concept to kids. And you know, right now, particularly once you have that conversation a couple of times, it might be worth saying, do you want to talk to your aunt on a video call? And go ahead and start introducing, or have them send a photo first. And you can say, this is what your aunt looks like now, and get them familiar with the ideas, and then slowly start to introduce a new way to have those conversations.
Yeah, I find that most young kiddos don't need or want a lot of explanation. And if you try to give them explanation, they're already off on their own thing. They just wanted to know, what's the name? What's going on? Okay, I'm done. I have toys that are calling my name right now. So very often it's the adults who are experiencing more distress, and the children a lot less distress. So treating the answer with a matter-of-fact tone of voice and just saying, yeah, so Joey changed their name. They're going by Joanne now, and it's pretty exciting. I think it's pretty cool. So just remember that, and that's it. That might be all that they need to know.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and I know you both alluded to it, but the celebratory nature in which it's explained to anybody, regardless of age, really is what sets the stage for a person's willingness to be open. I talk to parents all the time about writing their disclosure letters for their kids to extended family members. And I always invite them to start it with, we're really excited to share the news of our child. And here's what's happening. And we're thrilled that so-and-so found their authentic self at such a young age. And we know you'll join us in celebrating our child as, now Joanne. And, the truth is, might that be a little bit manipulative? Maybe, but I actually think what it's doing is, first, I have no issue being passive aggressive when somebody has the potential to be a jerk. B, I feel like it really does, and we're doing this kind of thing perhaps subconsciously all the time in our presentation. We can be like, oh my God, this is really going to be stressful, but well, everybody around us is like, oh my God, what's the stressful thing? How should I get my stress response ready? What do I do? And if we just start it with, this is really awesome, and we're so excited and proud of our child, and we know you'll join us, that person looks like kind of a dick if they don't just jump in. And most of the time, people that we're sharing with us don't want to look that way. So even if they don't totally understand it, they're much more likely to be like, oh, well, I guess if Debbie's happy about it, I'll give it a shot and see what's going on.
So I also want to mention there are a couple of questions that are coming up in the Q&A that are asking important questions about hormones and things like that. And I do want to, before we answer anything specifically, and about kids transitioning at school. So these are big, huge, meaty, juicy questions with a lot of aspects to discuss. And I want to encourage everyone, if you haven't already visited our website at transfamilies.org, to check us out there. We have a lot of resources that are just available on the site. So resources about different kinds of transitioning. Not everybody uses hormones. Not everybody chooses surgical transition. And especially when we're talking about little kids, we're just talking about a social transition. We're talking about names, clothing, hair, toys, really very simple things, expression essentially. So please be sure to check out the website and look in the resources and all the different pages that are available there. We have a lot of information in our FAQ section, etc. So, okay. Part of the tension right now, all of the legislation that is sweeping the country is it's not just localized in conservative areas. It is in other parts of the country as well. But in conservative areas, it feels like the battle is more exacerbated. And that could be because of families of faith very often don't have exposure to other ways of being. It could be any number of reasons, but I'm wondering if either of you can speak to how one in this moment, with this sort of larger than life attention going on about whether it's even allowable to be trans anywhere in the United States, how do you talk to your conservative family members right now when they're getting so much more information about why trans people shouldn't be in schools, why they think trans people shouldn't be in schools? How do you navigate that without
talk to them? You don't talk to them. No. Only if they choose not to talk to you. But if you want to keep trying, you can. No, seriously, it's hard right now because they've been doing media studies and watching what's going on. And out of all of the stories about trans people that have taken place in the last few months, about 93% was on Fox News or OAN. So they are definitely hearing all of the negative stuff, the PC police, the men invading women's spaces types of narratives, and that kind of thing. We are not seeing the other media outlets pick it up and try to combat that narrative. So it is very, very one-sided, and it's very one-sided with a lot of misinformation. The best thing that I could offer as advice is to just let your family member know, they're trying to use kids as a social issue to win voters. It's just not true. I'm open to questions. Why don't you actually talk to me instead of listening to a talking head who's probably never spoken to a transgender child? Like, I'm happy to have these conversations with you if you're willing to learn, but you have to know that these are not serious issues. They're being pushed by people who just lost an election, and they're trying to find something to get people angry about to stay connected to them. And they may or may not want to hear that, but if you do offer, I'm here to have a conversation, but it can't be from you quoting someone that you saw on, on the Blaze or on the Tucker Carlson show. Just please ask me the questions. I can get you the resources to the medical organizations that they're not talking to or talking about. I can get a great book for you to read and promote Michele's book. Like, there are great things that you can do that highlight the other side of the story. But yeah, right now we're not getting the media coverage we want. They probably wouldn't want to listen to the media that is covering it anyway. They would say that it's slanted. So do what you can to invest in the personal narrative, but just know that there are some people who are not going to be persuaded. Hopefully your family members are more of the movable middle, and that they will listen to reason if you are open to answering their questions and having some kind of intense conversations with them. But you also need to set up your personal boundaries in advance and know when it's just not going anywhere, and say, I've provided you with reading material. It's now on you, and I'm going to go back to tending to my kid.
Michele, anything to add? If not, I have got some more questions.
Yeah, well, I think the boundaries are important, and also a lot of folks who are coming from a conservative slant also are using religion as an excuse. And so I have tried to develop enough resources of a variety of different religions and religious people, leaders, who, if it comes down to, well, that's what my priest said, or that's what the imam said, or that's what whatever, like, okay, well, would you be open to talking to so-and-so who might provide a different perspective for you? And I find just frequently both the conservative and the religious part of that are hand in hand. And occasionally I'll get a wonderful, eloquent Catholic nun to speak to my client's parents or somebody like that, where they're just like, well, all right, haven't totally bought in, but it makes sense. And if she thinks that, then maybe I'll actually read some of that stuff you sent me.
The reality is that people who are transgender or non-binary or genderqueer, they are born in every type of family that there is, everywhere in the world, every culture, every faith community. It's not exclusive. Now, whether a person is safe enough, feels safe enough to disclose that they are trans, that's a different story. But I say all of that to emphasize that even in the most conservative communities, people do support transgender folk. Churches do step up, and that's Christian churches, that's synagogues, that's in all families of faith do find space to get support. It may not be in every faith community, but it does happen. So let's talk about joy for a minute. There are a couple people who are asking questions about that. How do we make space for joy? How do we emphasize the happiness and the excitement, the specialness of our children or our family members who are trans? How do we, what are some of the ways that we do that? One way, if you've been watching our Facebook page, Trans Families on Facebook, we have a series of posts today pointing out all kinds of good news stories. And our development manager put together a music list the music's all made by trans people. It's amazing. It's a really, really great music list on Spotify. I highly recommend it. We also, Debbie runs our blogs, and she regularly highlights really good news stories, things that are happening around the world, people who are doing good things, artists, authors, things like that. They're one of our favorite people, a young woman whose family came to our groups years ago, now has over 2 million followers on TikTok. And she's an amazing young trans woman who's been nominated for a GLAAD award this year. So there are definitely sources out there. And again, I recommend joining our newsletter, watching our newsletter. We post about it on Facebook all the time, because even though this is a stressful time and it's rough, what's happening in legislature, it is also very exciting because there's so much literature, there's so much music, there are books and movies and television shows and social media leaders who are non-binary, who are transgender, who call themselves genderqueer, who are making incredible media right now. It's a pretty fun time to be out in the world and be aware of transgender people, for sure. Do you all have any favorites that you want to point out?
I love the idea of the books, and that's why we've had a couple of the blog posts that are about books with trans and non-binary characters, intersectional identities, for the younger group, but also for the teens, the tweens, and the teens. I think knowing the history is great. So we even had some for learning about the history, the trans elders, the pioneers that came before. And set up the world that we are able to give our kids right now. Like you said, finding the influencers, Alok, I don't know how to say their last name, A-L-O-K. All you have to do is type that into Google, I'm sure, and you find their information. They're a non-binary person who is fabulously non-binary and proud of it. I think anything that celebrates the openness in gender expression and pride in oneself and the fearlessness is great for any person, whether they're binary or non-binary, to just see that kind of openness and freedom. Jeffrey Marsh is on TikTok with the most positive, amazing posts every single day, oozes love, is a fabulous person to follow with the most soothing voice to go with it. So those are the kinds of things. And then just around our home, celebrating all the little milestones, celebrating the transiversary, putting out all the different pride things all the time. I think my daughter probably gets sick of all the different trans themed things that I find. And we have a whole bookshelf full of unicorns and rainbows and other happy things that are just great to have to have around as like visual reminders of the beauty and diversity in the world.
All of that. And I think it's amazing too when young people in particular have the ability or the opportunity to meet folks who, first of all, I'm a big history nerd when it comes to knowing our history. And so I agree completely I love talking about trans elders, but also for young people being able to have a peer who might just be a couple of years older or farther along in their identity or exploration process can be a lot of fun, because when first coming to gender exploration, it can feel like a big, scary world, even if you have the most loving of parents. And so being able to hear from somebody who's just a few years older than you that, yeah, it was really tough and it's really amazing now. And here are all the things I'm doing now that I never thought I'd have the opportunity to do. I'm going to the prom as my authentic gender. I'm doing all of these different things as my authentic gender, to just give somebody a little bit of hope that it's not going to take that long to start to feel comfortable in your true self skin.
Thank you for that. I want to bring up one other aspect of intersectionality that we haven't touched on specifically yet, and that is race and gender queerness. For those who are still here with us, we've lost a few people, but that's okay. For those who are still with us, if you aren't already aware, Black trans women are in more danger than almost any other human in the United States. And that's a chilling fact that that can really put the fear of God in you. And so I would like, I haven't looked up the numbers right now. I don't know how many people have been, how many trans people have been, oh God, it just pains me to say, have been murdered this year so far. I didn't look it up, but I wonder if either of you can speak to how one, especially in a parental role, how the heck do we carry that? How do we love our babies and celebrate them and protect them as they step into the world when they are when they do embody those intersectionalities?
I'll just say quickly, as a white parent of a white child, I really can't speak to that experience. I wouldn't dream of trying. What I can do is do my part as a white woman to address racism overall, because so much of homophobia and transphobia really stems from practices of white supremacy. It's controlling other bodies. It's labeling what is good or normal or preferred, and anything that is outside of that is policed, both figuratively and literally. So the best thing that I can do, not having those intersecting identities, is to do my part as a white person to deal with racism overall, I think, and to educate my kids on it so that they can continue having these conversations and moving the process forward, because it's going to take everybody of all ages to finally get beyond this. Like, we failed for so many years that it's going to take all of us now.
Yes, and to use the privilege that we have, because again, as a white, queer, cisgender person, there are a lot of things that I can conceptualize, but I will never experience, and I don't have, at least to the best of my knowledge, up to this point in their lives, I don't have a trans kid. But I certainly want to recognize for all of my kids, to make them aware that, of course, of white supremacy, and also of cis sexism, of the assumption that being cisgender is better than, and to really make certain that they go into the world with their eyes wide open, that is in fact not true, that being trans or non-binary or genderqueer is equally valid to being cisgender, and that being a Black or brown person is no less than being a white person, and that the country is has been built on white supremacy and colonization, and that as white people who can recognize that, we have an obligation to dismantle that.
Those are very good answers. Thank you for that. I have nothing to add to that. Those were so such complete and wonderful responses. Thank you. Somebody did ask what our Facebook page is. I've typed it in. I hope that it worked so people can see it. It's Trans Families US on Facebook, if you would like to go and look there. There's a question that's been waiting for a little while about, it says, we are the only family with a trans kid, in quotes, at our school. I say that in quotes because of course we are not, but that's what our principal has told us. Have you succeeded in bringing in parents of cis kids to also be squeaky wheels when you need support? It's a big question. And, I have to say, it's not impossible to turn a school. It's not impossible to help administrators move forward in understanding what it means to be truly inclusive. But it does take work. And sometimes it takes bringing in someone to train. It often takes the energy of the PTA. So if sometimes when a school administrator is not interested in listening to you, or doesn't want to bring in training, doesn't want to explore this, or thinks they already have all the answers anyway, then the PTA can do it all on their own. They don't have to have the principal's permission to initiate training for themselves and for teachers. So our founder, Aidan Key, actually does training across the country for schools on this very issue, how to get them up to par, how to get them to understand that actually being inclusive of all trans kids helps every single person in the school. It makes every single person's life better. But your particular question of bringing in parents of cis kids, how do you get them to support you? You're nodding, Debbie. No?
Michelle just unmuted. That was her cue. No, I think that's the thing. In any setting, it's finding those allies. You're building your little army before you go to the administration. It's the kid who plays with your kid regularly, and then you make small talk with that parent, and you start feeling them out, and then you see if they would be an ally. And then from there you expand. They might know someone else who would be willing to jump in and advocate with you as well. So it's a little scary at first. You wouldn't just run and announce, hey, I have a trans kid, or would you be an ally, because our kids play together. But you can start talking about TV shows, or this great movie that had this kid in it, and it was so amazing. What was the one that was with Justin Timberlake recently? It's not even trans kid, it's a gender nonconforming child. But you can, Palmer, you can talk about that. You can talk about documentaries, and say, do you think we have kids like this in our school? Wouldn't it be great if we could make it more welcoming for them, and see how they are? And if they act horrified, cut the small talk short and wave the next time instead of talking, and then don't even make eye contact the next time, and go to the next person, and just find your allies, because we know that they're there. And if you get that small group of support with you, you're not going to feel alone approaching the school. You can then go in with some statistics, and just let them know by math, they will have more than one student in the school who's, if not trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary, questioning, gender fluid, trying to figure things out. And you can, go in as a group, solidarity. But yeah, I did it at our daycare. I did it in our homeschool group later. It was just one-on-one conversations with people to kind of feel where they are. And then we created our chosen family through that eventually. But it was finding those allies that made the big difference.
I did the same thing when the child is coming out in school, is identify sometimes I refer to them as their cheerleaders, their allies, so that the kid doesn't have to constantly be coming out by themselves, or constantly be answering all of the questions by themselves. And so it's, who are the ones that you can trust will share a little bit of your story accurately, so that you don't have to always be the one answering the questions. it's exhausting to have to come out all the time. It's exhausting as a kid, it's exhausting as an adult, it's just exhausting as a parent. So being able to formulate those ally networks, and sometimes it can even be helpful when you have, I think it can always be helpful actually, when you have very outspoken cis allies who don't have a connection to, they don't have a trans kid, but they're just really ardent allies and people who want to be inclusive and want the school in which their kid attends to be inclusive. It's not right, but sometimes it's that sense of, a lot of times I'll get the call from a school like, well, can you explain to our principal why it's okay, why we should have diversity training? Well, why in the world would I, as a cisgender person without a transgender kid, be the one to convince you that it's appropriate to have training? I think it's ridiculous, but I can certainly use an amount of privilege and power to push for that, and that's what I'll do. So I think that having allies is critical to movement.
Something that reminds me of is I get really hot under the collar when I hear that a school principal or a school teacher or something like that has said to a parent, well, what do you want me to do? Like, we don't really know what to do. So how would you like me to handle it? You know, for the most part, parents themselves are trying to figure out what's going on. Most parents are already in the position of like, I don't know. I'm figuring this out myself. I'm researching myself. How, you're asking me what to do in your school? Don't you know? So
I actually love those opportunities. Sorry.
well, if you're ready to answer them, they can be great. But for most parents, they are still figuring it out themselves. This is, I don't know. That's what my child's vice principal said to me is, okay, well, how would you like us to handle this? And I thought, what the heck? Don't you know how to run a school? So here's the other piece to that. You know, our public schools have been in the position of teaching children of many, many backgrounds, many faith backgrounds, many cultural backgrounds, many economic backgrounds. This is not new territory for them, even though it feels new and uncertain because the question is about gender. For some reason, when that's the piece put on the table, very often administrators become deer in the headlights. They feel immediately stuck. They don't understand how to answer the question. But the reality is they know exactly how to answer the question. They just don't understand that a person's gender doesn't need to be dictated in the way that it's being dictated within the schools. We don't have to separate people by boys line up here and the girls line up here. This class is only for boys and this class is only for girls. There are numerous ways for us to categorize ourselves that doesn't need to have anything to do with our gender. So anyway, I won't keep going on that, but I do get a little hot under the collar about it. And so we do have some resources for that. And the HRC Foundation has on their website a section called Welcoming Schools. It's a fantastic resource if you are approaching your school right now and you're trying to get some traction for your child or for an ally. Welcoming Schools has a lot of tools at the ready. So consider looking there. One of our attendees asks Michele if you'd be willing to share your religious resources. How do people reach you, Michele? Are you willing to share your email?
Sure. I can put it in the chat. Would that be best, or how do you want me to do it?
How should we do this? That's a very good question.
I'll put it in the chat right now, and then if you want me to do it differently, I can. And the reason that I said I love the question is I don't love the question when it's asked to parents or kids. I love when the parent says to me, hey, the principal just asked me what to do. And I'm like, oh, this is awesome. We will totally put this together. And if what they're asking for is guidance and help, I will give you guidance and help to the point where if they thought that their mind was blown before, we were just like, all right, you wanted the guidance, here you go. Here's best practice. And if you're unwilling to go with it, I actually will say to a lot of parents, set up a 504 meeting and let's get all of this documentation in place so that your kid can have this and nobody can question it. Because if you're not willing to do your own homework, we're willing to do the homework and have everything that the kid asks for in the plan.
All right, we have reached the end of our time. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Debi and Michele, so much for giving of your time and your expertise and your experience. You've been so generous tonight. And I think everyone has been really appreciative. There are thank yous popping up in our Q&A right now. So if you are here still, you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@transfamilies.org, and we will happily connect you to Debi or Michele, Dr. Angello, and also answer any other outstanding questions you have. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.